Okay, so on to the talk. Just going to go over here. So just a bit of background context. My academic background is ecology, but I also worked in the psychedelic field as scientific advisor to the Beckley Foundation, which funds and instigates research into psychedelics. So my work sort of spans two worlds. But I think of it as ecology is the science of interconnection, and psychedelics so it's the intellectual understanding of the interconnection of things, whereas psychedelics give rise to direct experiential comprehension of that interconnection. So we are in the 6th great mass extinction of life on planet Earth. In May of this year, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Ecology and on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services produced this report. And it was compiled by 145 world experts from 50 different countries. It took 3 years to do, and was looking back at 50 years worth of data. It's the most comprehensive assessment of its kind ever undertaken. And the report makes for very grim reading. The degradation and destruction of ecological systems, of biodiversity, species extinction, and the living systems which underpin life on planet Earth are being degraded and damaged at an ever-accelerating rate, and species loss is higher than it's been for many millions of years. So we are in a very dire global situation. One of the interesting findings from this report was that lands inhabited by indigenous people was some of the only lands populated by or under the management of human beings that wasn't being ecologically degraded. And in fact, there was a study that came out recently that found some areas inhabited by indigenous people is actually in better ecological shape than protected areas. So some indigenous people cultures use psychedelics. So here we've got some Huchal Indians in Mexico who use peyote cactus. The Yanomami use yopo, which DMT is the active ingredient. That's a Mazatec shaman, Don Natalia Martinez, with the rumbe mushrooms. These are Kashanawa shamans from the Amazon. So some indigenous groups use psychedelics as part of their practices, but not all. But a common linking feature of all these people is they live incredibly nature-connected lives. They're constantly in the natural environment, and indigenous people tend to have this view of the self that's quite different to us. We live quite individualized, egoic lives in our Western materialistic technological civilization, but these people have a more kind of group community reference existence and see their environment as an extension of themselves to a certain degree. So why would you destroy your environment when you're only going to harm yourself? That's the sort of intuitive knowledge that they have. So one of the issues, and what I think stems or gives rise to the ecological crisis, is our increasing disconnection as a civilization. So this began when we started farming, and when we did that, it sowed the seeds of human civilization as we know it now, and we started being able to live in cities, and more of us came to be living together in greater numbers than ever before, and that sort of totally changed the trajectory of our civilization, but it came at a cost. And our domestication of plants and animals domesticated us as well. It was a two-way domestication. And it changed the way we interacted and viewed nature. It became a resource to be controlled and used to the loss of other species that might have been competing for that space. It gave a quite different mindset. And then, fast forward, as a result of that, we started urbanising. We started living in cities, and as a result, became increasingly cut off from nature. So just over half our population now live in cities, and the UN think by 2050 about 2/3 of the world population will live in cities. So increasing urbanisation is another sort of issue with this nature disconnect. The most recent wave of disconnection appears to be coming through technology. So television, computer games, the internet. So this disconnection can occur on a broad range of levels. So there can be a disconnection from one's core self, a disconnection from others, and a disconnection from the world or universe at large. My good friend, Dr. Ros Watts, has done some interesting research at Imperial College using psilocybin for major depression. And one of the things she found as part of her qualitative research was that all these people who were depressed described their depression as being linked to this feeling of disconnection from those things I just described. And that the psilocybin therapy worked in part by reconnecting people to themselves, to others, to the world at large. And this was an enduring thing that's tended to stay with people after the initial experience. So yeah, this kind of disconnection on the interpersonal level is fueling the mental health crisis, whereas a disconnection to nature is fueling the environmental crisis. So if we zoom out for a second, when astronauts view the planet Earth from space, they tend to undergo profound cognitive shifts. This is a permanent change in how they view themselves and their planet and their place in it. And so this can be sort of described as truly transformative experiences involving senses of wonder and awe, unity with nature, transcendence and universal brotherhood. There's an interesting sort of psychedelic backstory to this photograph. So this is the Apollo 8 Earthrise photograph, which has been described as the most influential environmental photograph ever taken. And it was snapped by NASA astronaut Bill Anders on Christmas Eve 1968. In the winter of 1965, then merry prankster and writer Stuart Brand was sat on a rooftop on LSD overlooking San Francisco. And he knew it was a sort of distortion of his LSD brain, but he could see this sort of fisheye lens effect where the horizon was curved. And that in turn made him wonder, why is no one taking a photograph of the Earth from space yet? We've been to space, why has no one done that? So this idea came to him, and then he came down off his trip and it sort of stayed with him. So he started this campaign and made these badges, why haven't we taken a photograph of the whole Earth yet? And he sent them to Congress and NASA, and and then a sort of few years later, the NASA astronauts did snap this photograph. Not saying that there's a link there, but it's interesting, kind of the psychedelic overview effect, and then the astronauts overview effect. And one of the things Bill Anders said about this photograph is like, we went all that way to find the moon, what we ended up discovering was the Earth. So another useful concept is that of biophilia, a concept developed by biologist Yo Wilson. And so this is the connections that human beings seek with the rest of life. So again, this theme of connection coming up. We've spent 99.99% of our species' existence living in natural environments, so our psychology, our physiology is adapted to those environments. So, unsurprisingly, with that in mind, being in nature, and being cut off from nature, has some very profound effects on our health. So there's a substantial body of research literature to show that nature connection has some really important, is a really important predictor of a number of psychological health measures. So it is associated with lower anxiety, increased positive effect and happiness, life meaning and vitality, and enhanced psychological functioning at the state and trait level. Being in nature, the effects of nature exposure or immersion has also substantial benefits, but it's something distinct while also highly related to nature connection. And furthermore, the more connected to nature you are, that acts in turn as a mediator for the benefits you get from actually spending time in nature. So that's something to bear in mind in terms of importance for health. The other really interesting thing about one's level of nature connection, so nature connection or nature relatedness, it's the degree to which you self-identify as being part of nature, which of course we all are. That's like an inescapable fact. Only some of us have forgotten that or been removed from it. But interestingly, nature connection has been found, so in quite a few different research papers, it's been found to be a strong predictor of pro-environmental awareness. And in fact, it seems to be perhaps the single strongest psychological predictor of pro-environmental behaviour. So as one's connection to nature goes up, one's concern does as a side effect. So, wouldn't it be handy if there were tools available that could induce the overview effect without the rigmarole and cost of getting to space, that could enhance our connection to nature and our biophilia? Well, such tools exist and have been used by cultures for centuries or millennia, and no prizes for guessing what those tools are. It's an example to hear. So this is just a little account from the Imperial Psilocybin Depression Research. It's got a nice sort of link to the overview effect. Like Google Earth, I had zoomed out. For weeks afterwards, I was absolutely connected to myself, to every living thing, to the universe. So this is kind of suggesting that the psychedelic, kind of the peak or mystical experiences that psychedelics can occasion are providing an alternative, and I would say more egalitarian route to a very similar transformative perspective shift as for like going to space. So one of the common linkages between the overview effect, between psychedelic experiences, between things like out-of-body experiences of being in nature, is the experience of awe. So awe, stimuli that are vast, that transcend current frames of reference, and that require new schemata to accommodate what is being perceived. So it's that experience of being very, very small in relation to something very much bigger. And that has been linked to increases in well-being and pro-social effects in the wake of that. So awe is a really good thing for us to experience. So, psychedelic usage was widespread in the 1960s, as I'm sure we all know, and that's when the kind of environmental movement really bloomed, as did the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement. So interestingly, we know from the research done now, as well as psychedelics increasing this nature connection, which is a predictor of pro-environmental awareness, it also increases openness, which I'll get to in a bit, but it seems linked to they have this effect that makes people anti-authoritarian. So there's this tremendous sense of power and authority that can come through the primary mystical experience that these substances can catalyse. And it seems people are less inclined to be sort of like to be told what to do. As Tim Leary, in one of his quotes, like, think for yourself and question authority. And authority doesn't like being questioned by the mass population. So, Richard Nixon effectively felt that psychedelics made hippies. So he thought if you could criminalise the psychedelics, it would kind of cut things off the root. So it seems the criminalisation of psychedelics back at the end of the 60s was more of a political move, kind of dressed as a public health measure. So just a bit about the mechanism of how we think from the research and so far that psychedelics connect you to nature. So this is a sort of a simple-ish plot depicting some very complex MRI brain imaging data that's been condensed down into something that's vaguely understandable. And so this is placebo, this is a high dose of psilocybin. These different bits here represent different parts of the brain, different brain regions doing different things. And yes, so under psilocybin, the brain, the interconnectivity, global interconnectivity of the brain radically goes up. So different parts of the brain that are usually separate and compartmentalized start linking up and cross-chattering and talking to each other. And this seems partly linked to the default mode network of the brain, has a few sort of controller hubs, and interestingly, blood flow, it was thought that maybe brain activity was going up in the psychedelic state, but at least according to this psilocybin brain imaging data, it's actually blood flow to these controller hubs has been turned down. And when these are taken out, it allows for this more sort of free-flowing, dynamic, creative, entropic state of consciousness. And so when the default mode network, which is essentially the neural basis of the sense of self, or the ego, is powered down, then perceived boundaries between self and other dissolve and break down. So there's this kind of expanded state of self-nature overlap, catalyze. And so we think from the research, I can't say too much because we're sort of in the process of submitting a paper, but it was interesting what Stephen said about being in nature and having these experiences, and it seems there's definitely a link to, obviously, to unsurprisingly, maybe being in nature and having these ego loss experiences and sort of, becoming one with nature. So, one way of thinking of it is psychedelics are agents of connection. So at the level of the neuron, we know that they catalyze neurite and synaptic formation. At the level of the brain, they increase global connectivity, and we know the increased connection to self, to others, to nature, to the universe. So this is some early data, survey data, obtained by a researcher friend, David Luke, and colleague. And this was interesting in, it was sort of looking at the sort of nature connection potential of the various psychedelics. So interestingly, all 150 people who sort of went through and actually completed the survey, all 150 of them stated that their connection to nature had been increased following their psychedelic experiences. So it's pretty consistent, ubiquitous finding. Top of the pile, interestingly and relevant to this conference, is the psilocybe mushrooms. So psilocybin definitely seems to be top of the pile in facilitating nature connection and awareness. So we see LSD rates pretty highly as well, and then ayahuasca. We can see that it's quite interesting here. We maybe need more research, but going on for what I've been saying about nature connection and pro-environmental awareness, ketamine users are not going to be the ones to save us from the ecological apocalypse. There's been a few studies sort of looking at this nature connection or relationship to the environment in different populations. So, as part of the imperial research, like a subsample of some of the people going through depression and psilocybin therapy, their nature-relatedness measures have been looked at. And it's interesting that 7 to 12 months after their session, their nature-relatedness measures are the same. They've gone up and then they've stayed up. So that's something important to bear in mind. This isn't some fleeting thing. There seems to be a perspective shift that is solid and ingrained. And the other interesting thing about it is that these sessions, because of like the very strict regulations governing clinical psychedelic use, they tend to happen in very nature-deprived environments. Like I helped set up the current psilocybin depression room, Imperial, at the research hospital in Hammersmith. And the room before was a room designed for immunocompromised patients. So it's like you cannot think of a more sterile room than that. So we had to sort of like, really kind of, kick up the vibe into something better, which I think we might have succeeded in actually. But so despite being in these really clinical environments, people are still having these powerful shifts in how they sort of connect with nature. So it makes you wonder, like, if we started being able to have these experiences actually in nature, that would help move things along a bit. There's a sort of another study that kind of amalgamated 8 other studies, this time looking at healthy users, and these were sort of even in more clinical environments, in that they were in brain scanners in Germany. So you can't, that's really, having been in one myself as part of some research, that that's a pretty clinical environment. And it found, even in that situation, over a third of these people were reporting enduring changes to their appreciation for and connection to the environment up to 16 months later. So this is a long-term shift that stays with people. So another interesting long-term effect that psilocybin has is on personality trait openness. So openness is one of the big 5 measures of personality, and is associated with things like imagination, creativity, appreciation for aesthetics, and notably hunger for knowledge and appreciation and hunger for new experiences. And it's also associated with nature connection and pro-environmental awareness. Another sort of the effect of psilocybin and psychedelics on personality is something that doesn't seem to get talked about that much, but I think it's very interesting. So openness as well is associated with cognitive reserve. So as we age, we're going to have a level of cognitive decline, and it seems that having more cognitive reserve buffers you against cognitive decline and neurodegenerative diseases. So openness, it was thought prior to some research about a decade ago that personality is effectively fixed by the age of 30, and it takes maybe some heavy-duty therapy over years to change it even a little bit. But we kind of knew really that, already suspected that big experiences like a near-death experience can definitely radically shift your personality, but so can psychedelics like psilocybin. So one of the other interesting things we noticed from a recent paper is that neuroticism scores come way down. And if openness is sort of associated with quite a lot of good things, you don't want too much openness because you start sliding into mania. But high neuroticism is associated with many negative, like mental and physical illnesses. So being able to bring that down while boost openness is something that should not be overlooked or underestimated. So this is a bit of a wordy slide, but this is a very sort of seminal paper in this whole area. It's conducted by this guy Matthias Forsman of Yale and a colleague, and they looked at sort of lifetime usage of classical psychedelics. And what they found was, quite clearly, and a sort of really good sample size, was that lifetime experience with classical psychedelics, so LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, DMT, these things, was associated with this increase in ecological behaviour, and this was very much tied to this increased self-identification with nature that people experienced. And it didn't occur with any other substances. It's a unique property and capacity of the psychedelics. So this is some data from online survey data that I'm sort of currently with Imperial colleagues looking at and sort of writing up as a paper. And so what this is showing is this is nature relatedness scores here, and number of experiences of classical psychedelics. And what we sort of found was there was this very strong effect of psychedelic exposure on nature relatedness. particularly for people who rated below average for nature-relatedness. There was this big jump after even their first psychedelic experience, and it sort of went up with subsequent psychedelic experiences. And also at the same time we found that this nature-relatedness increase was very strongly correlated with well-being. So what I think is interesting about this, I need to be careful about inferring from it because it's not published yet, but not everyone is feels deeply connected to nature, particularly if you've not been brought up with access to nature. Like childhood exposure to nature seems to be an important determinant of nature connection in later life. And what I feel is the interesting capacity of psychedelics, certainly talking to a few people I've come into contact with who've had a single psychedelic experience and it's kind of radically changed forever, it seems, their relationship to nature or even their career or life trajectory as a result from that. I think psychedelics could play a role in converting nature skeptics, for lack of a better word. This is why I think they could be quite beneficial tools if used well in this regard. So this is just some examples, again, from the psilocybin depression trial on how this sort of experience of being part of nature might be experienced. So before I enjoyed nature, now I feel part of it. Before I was looking at it as a thing, like TV or a painting. You're part of it, there's no separation or distinction, you are it. I felt like sunshine twinkling through leaves, I was nature. So yeah, it's interesting to note that this increased nature connection and ecological concern is not just part of the psychedelic experience as well. So it's a common after effect of the near-death experience. So it kind of hints that it's part of some universal core human transcendent or mystical experience. So this is a sort of nice quote from a gathering of eco-psychologists at a conference 30 years ago. I think it highlights how sort of a lot of the indigenous groups sort of feel in relation to their environment, and it also, I think, hints at sort of the effects psychedelics can potentially have on our worldview and our view of nature. If the self is expanded to include the natural world, behaviour leading to destruction of the world will be experienced as self-destruction. So, Albert Hofmann, the discoverer, inventor of LSD, discoverer of the structure of psilocybin, it's interesting to note that he, long before he discovered LSD, he described these profound feelings of unity and oneness and joy in hearing from people like, particularly inner city people who discovered the wonders of nature through LSD. And one of the things he said at the mighty age of 101, shortly before his death, he came to feel that the property of psychedelics to reconnect us to nature is perhaps their most important. And I concur. And one of the things he said was alienation from nature and the loss of the experience of being part of the living creation is the greatest tragedy of our materialistic era. It is the causative reason for ecological devastation and climate change. Therefore, I attribute absolute highest importance to consciousness change. I regard psychedelics as catalyzers for this. So, we urgently need, as a global civilization, we urgently require a fundamental psychological shift at the population level. We need to regain urgently our connection to nature. I don't think there's anything more important to work towards than this. Thanks.
Hi there. At the start of your talk, you mentioned psilocybin through grain rather than mushrooms. Did
Yes.
you get to that point? I don't think so.
Yes, we'd like to hear a bit more about that.
Yes, please.
Cool. So, So this is, I'm not sure how much of a new discovery this is, but I'm part of a very small group of people that have kind of stumbled upon this. So I don't think this really applies or needs to apply to Psilocybe cubensis, the main mushroom that people grow, because it grows so abundantly and so prolifically, I don't really see the point. But if you grow the other species that are held in actually much higher shamanic regard in Mexico, much more potent than cubensis, and they're so potent that their mycelium is super potent. So all you need to do is inoculate some edible grain, let it grow on the grain, which doesn't take that long, and then you dry out the grain, and you can either eat it, or better yet, make tea out of it, and you're good to go. And the great thing about it, you can scale, if you're using liquid mycelium to inoculate the grain, you can scale this up infinitely. It allows these otherwise quite difficult to grow, take a long time to grow, and might be quite low yielding mushrooms that are otherwise fantastic. It allows you to access these species. So I think it's a really important breakthrough, because cubensis mushrooms are quite easy to grow. They're very egalitarian. Nothing against them, but they're not the only mushroom out there. And in my experience, they've all got their own thing going. So it'd be good to see a bit more diversity out there. So this is why I want to sort of try and push for this. And maybe under sort of chapter of the Psychedelic Society, I'd like to maybe try and teach people this, but we'll see how that goes. Hi.
Would you recommend psilocybin to people that actually feel related and connected to nature and feel conscious about the climate crisis, but actually are experiencing stress and anguish because of this?
That's a good question. So I would consider myself pretty nature connected anyway. Like I've always had a connection to it all my life, and that's partly why I think I found the psychedelics kind of. Before I found them, I was definitely pretty anti-drug, and then I sort of had my first mushroom trip, and that sort of made me revise my sort of views. And I did appreciate that connection to nature, particularly that the childhood wonder that returns. But I think it's an interesting point in that the more connected to nature you become, the more aware of what you become of what we're doing to it. And that can make you stressed and anxious. But but on a global level, I'm a bit I think we maybe need to feel a little bit concerned and stressed to maybe motivate action. Like one of the things eco-anxiety now is on the rise, and so people are getting increasingly anxious. And if they're going to go to the doctor, it's like, oh, doctor, I'm really anxious, the state of the planet and stuff. It's like, oh yeah, I know, it's shit, isn't it? Here's some antidepressants. They'll keep you sorted. It's like it's a band-aid for trying to sort of plaster over something that's much bigger and much more dangerous than the well-being of that individual. I think the short version is I value the perspective they've given me, despite my prior high connection to nature. But with that power does maybe come some, potential sort of anguish, I guess. So I would say, I don't know, maybe.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Do you have any strategies for getting those important experiences, psychedelic experiences, to the people that are, our political leaders, our corporate leaders who are at the forefront of causing the damage?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you're better off asking this to Stephen. He's more of sort of political mover and shaker. But do you want?
Here.
We're starting with senior people at various mental health organisations. yeah, it would be great. And actually also thinking about organisers representing older people, because there's interesting evidence showing that psychedelics can also relieve end-of-life anxiety. So the strategy is, if we can first get the kind of NGO charitable sector on board, then we'll go with politicians with their backup. But yeah, it's happening.
I mean, it's a good point. This was the Huxleyan approach, you know, turn on the powerful and the movers and shakers at the top, and the benefits will kind of trickle down. But the way it planned out, once Tim Leary was on board, it became much more sort of democratic in that view, and that had good and bad effects. Like, it's good in that, you know, a lot more people, I guess, have access to or even know about psychedelics than they maybe would otherwise. But the bad was that it got, you know, there was lots of reckless usage, and it got banned across the globe. Research got banned across the globe for the better part of half a century. So, yeah, it's a kind of, it's a shame, isn't it? Because like, politicians are probably the last people that are going to do it, but they're the people that most of all need to do that. Well, not need, I don't know, but yeah, but could really benefit, I think, from those experiences. So, yeah, that's something to think about. You know, I don't just go to the conclusion, well, we just have to put it in the water, it's the only way. Like, so maybe we can have a think about how to sort of go about that. It's not, yeah.
So I guess there are probably, I don't know, there's like much report of there being fads in Silicon Valley for taking psychedelics, and I guess that might be a representation of the rich and powerful who are already taking these substances, and we don't stereotypically think of as very nature connected, maybe. Is there much like evidence in relation to, have you sampled Elon Musk as his nature connectedness and how that related to his drug usage? Or?
Yeah, see, this is, so just if I may, it's a bit weird, but I'm going to hark back to your previous question, because I kind of like to answer that, and then I'll go into that. So firstly, I'm very sorry to hear about your friends with permanent psychosis like that. So one of the things that's taken very seriously in the clinical research is like any history of any, so basically there's no evidence as far as we know that a psychedelic experience can manufacture a long-term psychosis out of thin air. There's no, like, there's got to have been an underlying propensity.
That's definitely the case.
Yeah. I mean, as my work as part of the Beckley, Beckley Foundation, I got an email from this stressed mum in the States who said her daughter had sort of had a few ayahuasca sessions and gone bonkers, basically. Bless her. And she was like saying, you know, because obviously I work for a psychedelic research organisation, these things aren't safe, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I asked her, like, is there a family history of schizophrenia in your family? I was like, yes, my uncle and my granddad. So there's no way that your daughter should be touching psychedelics. You know, it's so when there is sort of like proper screening in place, these kind of accidents can be avoided.
I mean, I guess it's just, you know, when you're advocating people to grow stuff at home, I guess.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
That is true. There's not there's not the sort of screening stuff there, and there's interestingly, we think with cannabis, it seems people with an underlying propensity to psychosis are like slightly drawn to it as well. Interestingly, so it's like it's a weird mixed bag. But So going on to your other question, I think what's going on with Silicon Valley. I mean, partly it's microdosing, which is like, seems to be a bit of a modern fad. I've got nothing against microdosing. I guess I've just heard a lot about it as part of my work at the Beckley, and a little bit bored of it, to be honest. I think macrodosing is way more interesting. It's much better for deeper, proper work. So what it seems with like the LSD microdosing is like we've deplored the tiger, you know? Like LSD used to be like this countercultural bazooka, like cultural change, and now we just take a little bit of it and like we can increase our productivity and make some more profits, and it's like, but you know, if people want to use it as a creativity tool or a well-being tool or cognition enhancer, absolutely fine, and sort of go for that. Like, I think these are sort of like very chameleon-like tools. They're very much dependent on the intent and the context in which they're used. So I'm not saying there's like a one-size-fits-all approach here, but their ability to connect us to nature is definitely one of their fundamental properties, and most important, I would consider.
We have time for one more question.
only because no one else will take it. This question is more for Rosalind Watts, but I was hoping you could share. Do you think that we're at the stage where people with depression should be using psychedelics rather than antidepressants? And can you name any studies that have a sample size greater than 20 that say this?
Good question. I think I can answer on behalf of Ros, who I spoke to earlier today. She's in New York currently. So basically, watch this space is the answer. So there's a study, a phase 2 study happening at Imperial College right now. I think it's scheduled now to finish in August, and it's got a sample size of at least 60, but they may be trying to increase it to 100, or at least somewhere in between there. And before it was they did a phase 1 proof of concept study, so small sample size of 20 to see, is psilocybin worth looking at further, is it safe to give to people? And the answer to both of those questions was yes, but they didn't have any placebo group. It was a small sample size, partly because it's really expensive and hard to do. So they've now gone to the phase 2 study, much larger sample size. They've got a placebo group, and they're comparing it to a leading SSRI antidepressant, citalopram. So the culmination of this particular study in August of next year, I think we will have a clearer sort of scientific picture of the validity of that, and I definitely don't want to advise, without that basis, that footing.
All right, thank you so much, Sam. Thank you.